Welcome to Unleashed Learning TV and Unleashed Learning Radio for our podcast listeners. Now, student motivation is one of the top challenges that educators report to us all the time. And to help, we've got Dr. Nancy Dome, who's the founder and CEO of Epoch Education, here for a special three-part series on student motivation. Now, in part one, she shared with you definitions to help you think about student motivation. And here in part two, she's here to share with you specific actions you can take to help boost student motivation. So let's get part two started. Okay, so welcome back, Nancy. We're doing a three-part masterclass with you about student motivation because educators we've been working with and been reaching out to us have been saying that's a topic, especially during a COVID world, but also thinking about moving, hopefully, in a post-COVID world, how to support student motivation. So in the first episode, you gave us a definition of motivation, and you helped us think about why some of our learners might not be motivated. So this episode, we want to talk about what we can do. Like, what are some things we can start leaning into place or putting into place? So I want to know who should be responsible for implementing this stuff. You know, you kind of alluded to it in episode one, but who should be, when we're talking about the equity lens and student motivation, who's responsible for this?
Well, I mean, initially, the educator's the lead, right? The educator is responsible, but the responsibility is really about making connections with students. The educator has to create a space where students know that they can show up just as they are and it's perfect, right? And they need to provide scaffolds that connect them with the learning. And so the the educator has to create a space where kids want to learn, where the desire is high, when they're excited and it's interesting to them and it's connecting to them and it makes sense to them, and so and then if the educator really thinks about themselves less as a teacher and more of a facilitator, then you begin to see how that co-creation can work, because I can start it off as a teacher, but there's got to be space for the student's voice to really shine and massage and in some ways, recreate and restructure. I may have an idea, but it's only an idea to get something started. It shouldn't be the final product. It should look like it's a collaboration between all of us in the space who share that space.
It's great because what I'm thinking, we're the facilitator for that. We create the
Yeah.
conditions for that. And part of the conditions are to help bring out of everybody, and then it co-creates it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, there's lots of research in literacy around how people like reading acquisition. And this is part of how that operates. I mean, the same process about it. So it connects to science as well about how we get learning to stick. I mean, just
Yeah.
win, win, win. So as you know, we help educators learn a system that makes learning stick for everybody. And one of the keys in that system is the key of classroom for schools, or location for professional development people, right? That location's really, and you've alluded to this location helping to support motivation and bring out the best in people. So can you give us some ideas of what could be or should be in the space, or ways of thinking about setting up that classroom or location that you think really helps from an equity lens, student motivation or learner motivation?
Yeah. And so what I would identify, and it doesn't matter if you're in a physical classroom or in a virtual classroom, is number one, you have to allow for student input and voice. Like they have to be co-creators, co-directors, right, of what's happening. But there needs to be a climate of autonomy. Like I feel like there's less trust, like we're so directed, and there's got to be a climate for kids to figure things out for themselves, and in the process of figuring it out for themselves, really valuing and supporting them to take risk, like take risk and to like raise my hand in a virtual classroom and really give my best. I may miss the mark, but then how is that rewarded and supported, as opposed to me feeling like I made a mistake, right? I think that a lot of our students, and I think it is because of the way that we've shifted our education kind of process, are really like failure avoidant. They are afraid to fail, which means that they're afraid to try. And when you're afraid to try, there's nowhere to go from that point. And so if we really are talking about motivation, that creating that desire is really about creating a desire and a willingness to take risks and to fail, knowing that that is part of the learning process.
That, and there's so many, communities or in our educational space where it's just not safe because there's a history of not
Yeah.
being safe.
Yeah.
There's a
Yeah.
history of not being safe.
Yeah.
It makes me think, we talk about lifting the weights, as you know, right? So that's actually the science about sticks. But we always tell people, think about who's lifting the weights for how long and how many different kinds of ways.
That's
And that's
right.
the same online too, right? That who's lifting the weights for how long and how many different kinds of ways.
That's right. And when you think about that, I mean, you just made me think. I think about the from the teaching perspective of right now. I think part of why teachers are struggling online is because they're lifting the weights,
Yes.
right? They
Yes.
haven't shifted the weightlifting to the kids to figure out how to have them lift the weights,
That's right.
right?
That's exactly. And then what do you do? Because when we are in the schools and PD sessions, but when they start seeing that, then they know how to get more weights in more people's
Yeah.
hands.
Yeah.
So it becomes
Yes.
win-win-win.
Yeah.
Okay, so our last question for this episode is, um, what we talk about at Unleashed Learning is that what the science says makes learning stick. And one of the things that, and you've alluded to it in episode 1, but how to build a bridge between who the learners are from all the diversity they come from to the content. That's actually what gets it to stick. So can you tell us some ways? So we're a maths teacher, a science teacher, we run a PD session. How do we build a bridge between our content and students?
Yeah. And that goes back again to connecting to prior learning, prior knowledge, right? I think some of the strategies that I find super useful and engaging are like PBLs, project-based learning. Where kids not only understand what they're learning, but why they're learning. And I always think about when I was learning, in math, and it was the Pythagorean theorem, and I was like, I get it intellectually, but what do you use it for? Like,
Yeah.
what is it for? And then I remember having a math teacher, like we flew a kite. She had us, make a kite and then do the string, and we had to actually reverse the theorem to get to the height of the kite in the air by the length of the string and the but it was that was like for me it I'll never now I know exactly what it's used for and how it's and why. And I think that making those kinds of connections for students to see, okay, this has a real application, this is something that I can use, and that goes back to the connection, right? The motivation part. If I understand why I'm going to do it and why I need to know this, then it increases the likelihood that I'll be engaged in doing it. And then the other thing, I think another strategy is really looking at how do we start to do more integrated or interdisciplinary work. Again, we have departmentalized education,
Mm,
but we know as functioning adults
mm,
that our lives are not compartmentalized like that.
right.
I need math and writing at the same time. I need, all these content areas have overlap. I need math and science. They go together. You know what I mean? Technology and science and math, they're all connected. But we still treat them as isolated entities, and we pull in these other aspects as ways to support them, but then we teach them separately in a different content area, right? And so how do we begin to show that everything that we're learning is related? History is tied to science. You
Yeah.
can't have, science today without history of yesterday. And so how do we make those, connections just more authentic? So people, our students literally can be engaged and have a desire to want to understand and learn.
Makes me think, for the authentic part too, is if we know who they are, we know where they're
Yes,
coming from, who our learners are, the diversity of our learners, we see there's
absolutely.
gender and race and language and all the stuff that's in there, then we have ways to make that relative related to them. That's what I
Yeah.
heard you talking about.
Absolutely. And I think that, just the last thing on that is also it forces me to understand who I am, right?
Mm,
Because all those identities that I need to understand, if I have some bias against any of those identities, that's going to show up whether I want it to or not. And so me becoming aware of who my kids are and then taking a real honest look at, do I have feelings or issues about certain kids based on their learning styles or based on their behavior or based on their religion or based on their sexual orientation. and then I'm called to figure that out, because I think that that is also tied. If I know who you are and I don't respect who you are, I'm
Mm.
not sure that you can learn from me. I really don't.
Well, that's why we say who the educator is matters, that a reflective educator matters. And it makes me think, just personally as a teacher all these years, but some of my best teachers have been my students, because I find out my own bias.
Yeah.
I go,
Yeah.
I didn't know I believed that, or I didn't know. And then I can make decisions from that. But sometimes it's like, oh, I didn't know that about myself.
Yeah.
And then I can make decisions. And also I find out what my values are and what, where I'm showing up. So that's a really interesting part of the conversation about who we are matters in this.
Absolutely. And being willing to look in the mirror. And when the
Mhm.
mirror is held up to us, whether it's your student or a
Yeah,
colleague or whatever, being willing to look in and be a reflective practitioner to let it impact, future decisions.
fantastic. Okay, so we've done definitions. We've talked about how to put some stuff in action. And then you're going to come back in part 3, and
Yeah.
we're going to have some, because people have been asking for case studies.
Okay.
So we're going to ask you to give us some examples of people with an equity lens who put some of this stuff into place.
Okay.
We'll see
Sounds
you then. Thanks, Nancy.
good. Thank you.
So that completes part 2, and now it's your turn. We want to hear from you. Some of the best conversations take place after the episode. So after you're done, jump over to the comment section and let us know what's your one takeaway from part 2. Now, while you're there, grab your free ebook, The 5 Easy Ways to Make Online Learning Stick. And if you know anyone this episode would support, send it their way and help us share some student motivation support.